welcome to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood-Coleman, the Editor-in-Chief and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. This week, the featured country is Ethiopia, where a national emergency has been declared as Tigrayan rebels advance on the capital of Addis Ababa. First, some background. In 2020, the government of Ethiopia carried out a military offensive into the Tigray region to target rebellious regional leaders. The operation is brutal, with international observers warning of war crimes being committed by Ethiopian-led forces against the Tigrayan people. By mid-2021, it was evident that the Ethiopian government was unable to maintain its military offensive in the mountainous northern Tigrayan region, when rebel forces liberated cities from under the control of the Ethiopian military. In an effort to finesse the optics of defeat, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced that Ethiopian forces had left Tigray and that a unilateral ceasefire had been announced ahead of the crop planting season. In reality, however, United Nations witnesses on the ground indicated that Ethiopian forces in the area carried out targeted punitive measures, such as destroying key infrastructure and preventing food from being delivered into the region already suffering from war-caused famine. By November 2021, the landscape had crucially changed. In the first days of November, the Tigrayan rebel forces, the TPLF, were being augmented by the Oroma Liberation Army, OLA, a rebel group from Ethiopia's Oromia region. The TPLF and the OLA signed an alliance with 7 other rebel groups. In the first week of November, the joint forces at the time were 200 miles from the capital of Addis Ababa. The reality was that they would have to conquer difficult terrain to cover the remaining distance to the capital, and conceivably that could take several days or even weeks of fighting to do so. There was also the question of whether the TPLF and the OLO even wanted to conquer the capital, or if their intent was to force the hand of the Prime Minister and end the blockade that has prevented aid and supplies from getting into Tigray. As a result of the conflict, no food or fuel has been allowed into the region, with close to 500,000 people facing famine-like conditions and essential medication being unavailable due to the blockade. Perhaps the march to Addis Ababa was intended to pressure the Ethiopian government in these regards. For its part, the government of Ethiopia declared a nationwide state of emergency and warned residents of Addis Ababa that they should be preparing to defend their neighborhoods against Tigrayan rebels. Prime Minister Abiy said that citizens should undertake their role and cooperate with law enforcement entities. As well, the federal armed forces called on retired soldiers and army veterans to rejoin the military. The draconian measures did not stop there. The state of emergency meant that authorities could conscript any military-aged citizen with access to weapons. Furthermore, it would suspend any media outlets providing moral support directly or indirectly to the TPLF. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who ironically won a Nobel Peace Prize and then started a war, was in a grim situation facing a difficult conundrum. At the start of November, he had said, "We will bury this enemy with our blood and bones and make the glory of Ethiopia high again." Now, however, momentum was on the side of his so-called enemy. Did he launch a bloody, hot war in his country's densely populated capital? One that he might not even win? Or did he look towards a negotiated settlement that would in and of itself signal political defeat for him? Regardless of the decisions ultimately made by the Prime Minister, as November 2021 entered its second week, a scenario once thought unrealistic was now becoming a distinct reality. The Tigrayan rebels were marching towards the capital and in position to topple the Ethiopian government. The toppling of the Ethiopian government, such as it was, would mark a collapse into failed state status. Such an end would open up the country to possible extremism, given that the Ethiopian government has played a hand in pushing back the threat posed by the Islamist terror entity Somalia-based Al-Shabaab. It would weaken Somalia itself, since Ethiopian forces have been instrumental in keeping that country's fragile stability intact. At a broader level, a failed state in Ethiopia, the second most populous country on the African continent, would be destabilizing for the entire Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa as a whole. Indeed, within the latter part of 2021 alone, neighboring Sudan has been subject to a military coup d'etat. A failed state in Ethiopia would additionally affect United States security interests, since Ethiopia has been a reliable ally in the United States anti-terrorism efforts and allowed the use of Ethiopian airspace at times. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken was traveling to nearby Kenya to discuss the crisis unfolding in Ethiopia and warned that a hot conflict would be disastrous for the Ethiopian people and also for others in the region. Now on to some other stories unfolding in the world as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to threaten. In mid-November 2021, the government of Australia, where about 65% of the population was fully vaccinated, announced that it was placing approximately 2 million unvaccinated people on lockdown amid growing COVID-19 infection levels and intensifying pressure on the country's hospitals. Chancellor Alexander Schallenberg said, "We are not taking this step lightly, but it is necessary." Schallenberg indicated that the aim was to ensure a massive reduction in contacts between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. In order to enforce the new regulation, police would enact vaccination spot checks in public spaces. Germany's vaccination rate was only slightly higher than Austria's at 67.3%. The government of that country was scheduled to meet to discuss possible new restrictions given growing COVID-19 infection levels and intensifying pressure on the country's hospitals. In the Netherlands, where 84% of adults have been vaccinated, a lockdown light has been imposed as a result of growing COVID-19 infection levels in that country. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte said that the COVID crisis required a hard blow of a few weeks because the virus is everywhere throughout the country in all sectors and all ages. Rutte added, "Fortunately, the vast majority have been vaccinated. Otherwise, the misery in the hospitals would be incalculable at this moment." Lockdown was already reimposed in Latvia, where only 59% of the population was vaccinated. As well, members of parliament who refused to be vaccinated have been barred from voting on legislation and participating in debates until 2022. Meanwhile, the European Centre for Disease Control named Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Greece, Hungary, the Netherlands, Poland and Slovenia in its highest category of concern. Moving east to Russia, a partial lockdown was implemented in that country where the vaccination rate was only 35%, and Russians were skeptical of the Sputnik V vaccine. Across the world in Singapore, the government has made clear that persons who choose to remain unvaccinated by choice would have to pay their own medical bills from December 2021 onward. I continued to cover the COP26 Climate Summit taking place in Glasgow, Scotland in the United Kingdom. So far, COP26 has resulted in landmark deals with regard to coal, deforestation, methane and green technologies. That's the good news. Now for the bad news. As the COP26 Summit came to a close, a new agreement aimed at addressing the climate crisis was struck in Glasgow. Ensconced in the deal was a plan to reduce coal. The plan, however, was not to phase out coal, but in fact to phase down coal, an accommodation that critics suggested does not go nearly far enough. Also included was the commitment to provide more funding to help developing countries adapt to the dangerous impacts of climate crisis. Given that earlier pledges made to provide developing countries with $100 billion per year had not been met, there was grave skepticism about these new commitments. Left outside the agreement, however, was any pledge to limit the rise of temperature to 1.5 Celsius. Instead, the pledges would only limit global warming to 2.4 Celsius. As well, there would be a meeting in 2022 to revisit further limits with the aim of eventually reaching 1.5 Celsius goal. Some leaders indicated that this process indicated that there was a roadmap in place to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The reality, however, was that the worst of the climate crisis could not, and I repeat, could not be mitigated without a concrete plan to contain global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Progress on that front has been pending for some time, with some scientists already warning that it might be too late. But the only way to avoid the most damaging and catastrophic effects of the climate crisis, according to the respective scientific experts on this subject, would entail keeping the rise in global average temperatures below 1.5 degrees. Having a roadmap in place to eventually hit those targets might not be enough to prevent catastrophe. The disappointment from climate activists and climate action advocates was profound. For example, Swiss Environment Minister Simonetta Sommaruga said, "We would like to express a profound disappointment that the language we agreed on coal and on fossil fuel subsidies has been further watered down." Sommaruga added, "This will not bring us closer to 1.5 Celsius, but make it more difficult to reach it." The president of the COP26 Summit, Alok Sharma, said he was deeply sorry for the lack of meaningful progress, but expressed the need to protect the agreement as a whole. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that the planet was hanging by a thread. He added, "We are still knocking on the door of climate catastrophe. It's time to go into emergency mode, and our chance of reaching net zero will itself be zero." Finally, we end with the United States, where President Joe Biden's domestic Build Back Better agenda and bipartisan infrastructure packages were on the line. To recap, there were two bills to be passed. There was the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure package deal that already passed the Senate with the support of every Democrat and 19 Republicans. That bill included $550 in new funding for roads, public transport, rural broadband, and other infrastructure. There was also the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package to fund President Joe Biden's domestic agenda. Included in Biden's Build Back Better package to be passed through budget reconciliation would be investments in childcare, paid for family leave, free community college, and climate change mitigation. October 2021 was spent on intra-party deal-making as the president and 90% of the Democrats in the bicameral Congress grappled with intransigence from two Democratic senators, Manchin and Sinema. The price tag and programs ensconced within President Biden's Build Back Better agenda slated to be passed via reconciliation were renegotiated to satisfy the objections of Manchin and Sinema. Now the cost of Build Back Better had come down from $3.5 trillion to $1.75 trillion. Left outside would be paid family leave. Left in would be $400 billion for universal pre-K and subsidized childcare, $200 billion for child tax credits, $130 billion to extend ACA COVID subsidies and for Medicaid, and $555 billion for clean energy projects. As before, the intent was to pass both bills in the House of Representatives in simultaneity. That goal continued to be difficult, with progressives emphasizing that they would not vote for the bipartisan infrastructure package without guarantees on the broader Build Back Better package to be passed via reconciliation. Another problem could be from the Senate itself, where neither Manchin and Sinema had publicly committed to supporting the newly adjusted Build Back Better package. Nevertheless, on November 5th, 2021, following urgent intra-party negotiations, President Biden's landmark infrastructure spending package passed through the House of Representatives with bipartisan support. Indeed, the once-in-a-lifetime spending measure passed with 228 votes in its favor and 206 votes against it. Of those no votes, a handful of progressives voted against the bill, charging that it did not go far enough to address domestic policy challenges. Also among the yes votes were 13 Republicans. Hailing the accomplishment as a monumental step forward, President Biden declared finally Infrastructure Week. Having already passed the Senate, the bipartisan infrastructure package would land on President Biden's desk for signature into law. As the most significant investment in United States infrastructure in a generation, the passage of this legislation could only be understood as a major domestic policy victory for President Biden and a once-in-a-lifetime investment in the United States. Now, on November 15th, President Joe Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure package into law at the White House. Next on the docket would be the broader and more ambitious Build Back Better package, which passed the House of Representatives on November 19, 2021, and was then headed for reconciliation in the Senate. Other things I've covered in this week's political intelligence briefing included the attempted assassination by drone attack of Iraqi Prime Minister Kadhimi, the death of a senior Taliban commander killed in an ISK terror attack. I've also covered President Biden signing legislation that calls for sanctions after Manuel Ortega claimed re-election victory in sham elections in Nicaragua. Next week, I'll cover China's investment interests in Djibouti, U.S.-Sino relations regarding Taiwan, the status of Iran JCPOA talks, the status of coalition building in Germany, the status of BBB, Build Back Better reconciliation legislation in the United States, and the landscape in the Horn of Africa, specifically with regard to Sudan after the coup d'etat and the ongoing state of emergency in Ethiopia. I'd also like to take this time to mention my comprehensive Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunsets in the Graveyard of Empires, which will be available for purchase from the Country Watch website at www.countrywatch.com. Thank you for your time. Have a great day, and remember, now more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.